Number 16. Lamar Whitehead. Bishop Lamar Whitehead is an eccentric pastor from Brooklyn who has been making news headlines for years with his over-the-top behavior. He preaches based on the prosperity gospel, which associates the accumulation of wealth with spiritual well-being and a healthy relationship with God. Whitehead was known among locals for years before he began appearing in national news. He is perhaps best known for his conspicuous displays of wealth, including designer suits and luxury vehicles. As you can imagine, it wasn't overly surprising when federal agents arrested him in May of 2023 for suspected fraud, extortion, and other financial crimes. According to federal prosecutors, Whitehead solicited money from the victim through threats and false promises of enrichment. In one instance, he allegedly told someone he could use his political connections to make a multi-million-dollar business deal go through. Whitehead is accused of pocketing the funds and failing to deliver on any of his promises. According to court documents, Whitehead tried to con a businessman into giving him $500,000 and to let him in on some real estate transactions. He promised that he would use his connections with the city to obtain favorable treatment that would yield millions of dollars in profits for them both. In reality, he has no connections with the city and allegedly knew that he was incapable of delivering on the promise. Whitehead also allegedly used threats of force to obtain $5,000 from one of the businesses owned by the man he tried getting $500,000 from. Authorities have also accused him of conning a 56-year-old woman out of $90,000. According to federal prosecutors, he promised to help the woman buy a house. She withdrew the money from her retirement account and handed it over. When she got a bad feeling about the situation and asked for the money back, Whitehead reportedly told her that it was too late to back out and that the money had already been invested. He also allegedly lied to the FBI during the investigation and told them that he only had one phone when he actually owned two. Agents discovered the second phone's existence when they were scouring Whitehead's phone records and saw that he regularly texted a number saved under the name My Other Phone. Whitehead faces one count each of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and false statements. His lawyer, Dawn Florio, told the press that he adamantly denies any wrongdoing and said that he plans to vigorously fight the charges. His arrest came less than a year after masked thieves interrupted one of his services and stole all his jewelry. They also stole his wife's bling during the robbery, which was captured on camera and was being live-streamed online. The suspects were arrested and charged accordingly. In recent years, New York City Mayor Eric Adams has come under scrutiny for his alleged friendship with Whitehead. After Whitehead's recent arrest, Adams said that he expects everyone to follow the law and declined to comment further. Number 15. Shannon Kutuzi. While working as a youth pastor at the Crossing Church of the Nazarene in Houston, Texas in 2019, 29-year-old Shannon Kutuzi faced alarming accusations of abuse stemming from an incident that had allegedly happened 4 years earlier. The details of the case were largely withheld from the public, but authorities revealed that they believed she had an inappropriate relationship with a young man she mentored as part of her job as a pastor. A grand jury indicted Kutuzi on an indecency charge, and she was booked into the Fort Bend County Jail on $25,000 bond. She bonded out under conditions that required her to surrender her passport and to stay at least 500 feet away from the victim's home. The case received little press coverage, but court records show that Kutuzi was ultimately acquitted. Officials declined to provide the media or the public with an explanation for what led to the allegations being dropped. Number 14. Sean Goff. In 1993, Joy Risker entered Pastor Sean Goff's church in San Diego as a wayward teen in search of guidance and became entranced by his charismatic personality. She joined his youth group and they began an intimate relationship 3 years later. At the time, Goff was married to a woman named Sheila. After having their first child, he began pressuring Sheila to enter a polygamous relationship. She was against the idea, but eventually gave in out of a fear that she would lose her marriage and custody of their child if she continued to refuse. Joy's mother also disapproved of polygamy, but she ultimately gave her blessing to avoid losing her daughter. In 1997, Goff married Joy Risker at a polygamous church in Utah. She moved in with Goff, Sheila, and their son, and gave birth to 2 children over the next few years. Polygamy is illegal in California, and it's also socially shunned. And by that point, Sean had become a popular televangelist preacher for a large church that was deeply against polygamy. He and Joy kept their marriage a secret for several years before word somehow got out about his lifestyle. After being fired from his church, he formed his own group of Christian polygamists and began holding meetings regularly. In the meantime, Joy held a job outside the home while Sheila took care of their children. From the outside looking in, they looked like the polygamists' version of a perfect family. But as they say, looks can be deceiving. Over time, Sean became increasingly possessive over his second wife. He read Joy's email and controlled the finances and began lashing out in jealous fits of rage. When a male friend hugged Joy during her 21st birthday celebration at a club, Goff punched him in the face. During a party at a friend's house in 2003, Goff accused Joy of flirting with another man and lost his temper in front of everyone. A friend tried to calm him down, but he said he wanted to leave. He pulled Joy out of the house and could be heard yelling at her in the street, saying that she would never see her children again if she refused to get in the car with him. Goff later confided to friends that he was getting fed up with Joy's attitude. He described her as lazy and sloppy and talked about wanting to get rid of her. During a conversation with a co-worker, he said that he planned to give Joy a few weeks to shape up or ship out. In the meantime, Joy told her friends that she was planning on leaving Goff as soon as she had enough money to support herself without his help. She planned to take her 2 children with her and would have never even thought about leaving without them. During the early morning hours of September 19th, Goff's first wife left with the family's 3 children for a weekend trip. When she was driving home 2 days later, Sean called her and said that he had taken Joy to the hospital because she had gotten upset and cut herself when he threatened to sue for full custody of their kids. He asked Sheila to clean up the blood at the house, and she did as she was told. Sean returned home the next day covered in scratches. His clothes were torn and a rental SUV he had been driving was filled with mud and gas cans. Joy never came home, and Goff told people that she had left him and skipped town. Her friends and family didn't believe him, especially since she would have never left her kids behind. As more and more people began to ask questions, Goff gave different stories about where his wife had gone and who she was with. Suspicious that Joy's safety was in jeopardy, her friends emailed her and told her they wanted to meet up and talk. She replied saying she didn't want to meet and claimed she was traveling around. Unconvinced that they were communicating with Joy, the friends continued pressuring for answers. In response, they received an email telling them to mind their own business, which seemed extremely out of character. They got the police involved, and investigators were quick to question Goff, who claimed that Joy had run off with another man. He eventually realized that law enforcement and Kayla's loved ones were not going to stop looking for her until they found answers. The stress of maintaining a cover story became too much to handle, so he showed up at a police station and confessed to murdering Joy. He refused to disclose the location of her body, which was found by hikers in the Arizona desert a few months later. During his trial, Goff argued that he fatally stabbed Joy in self-defense. But there was overwhelming evidence that he had orchestrated her murder, and the jury convicted him of the crime in 2006. He was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Number 13, Stuart Allen Clark. In February 2021, a pastor from Malden, Missouri named Stuart Allen Clark went viral for delivering a degrading sermon that objectified women and blamed them for the poor behavior of men in relationships. An internet user who was watching the service online felt horrified by Clark's behavior and shared the footage on social media. In the video, Clark discussed how women should stay thin for their husbands, even if they can't be a trophy wife like Melania Trump. More specifically, he said that wives should pay enough attention to their looks for a participation trophy and to avoid looking like a butch, peppering his disturbingly sexist rant with comments like, "Thank God for makeup." Clark also preached that God made men to be attracted to good-looking women, but that most women don't seem to understand this because they don't try hard enough to be attractive. The speech only became more cringeworthy as it went on, devolving into commentary about how wedding cake seems to diminish a woman's desire for intimacy and how women should wear perfume and makeup so they don't look ugly and stink. Clark went on to imply that it's acceptable for a man to cheat on his wife if she fails to meet his needs in the bedroom. He also said that the best way for women to become sufficiently attractive is to control their weight, and that they should put down the cupcakes and instead put on makeup. The First Baptist Church apologized for the sermon and said that Clark's views don't align with the church's values. The pastor took a leave of absence and went to counseling. Less than 2 months later, he issued a statement announcing his plans to return to the pulpit. Clark apologized for his unbiblical remarks and acknowledged that he had nobody to blame for his behavior except himself. Number 12. Pastor Rodney Howard Brown. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020, government bans against large gatherings were met with fierce resistance throughout the United States. Many people blatantly ignored orders to limit their socializing and to practice social distancing to curb the virus's spread. In Tampa, Florida, a controversial megachurch pastor named Rodney Howard Brown kept his church open in defiance of a stay-at-home order limiting gatherings to no more than 10 people. During his sermons, he openly mocked the public's growing fears over the virus's spread, describing the illness as a phantom plague and claiming that it was part of a bigger plan to shut down houses of worship and exterminate people by injecting them with a deadly vaccine. Howard Brown also encouraged his parishioners to continue shaking hands during church meetings because, in his words, they were revivalists, not pansies. In late March, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office visited Howard Brown's congregation and warned that his church meetings violated the stay-at-home order. The gatherings continued, so Sheriff Chad Chronister issued an arrest warrant against the pastor for unlawful assembly and violating public health emergency orders. In a statement, the sheriff said he had no choice but to take legal action after Howard Brown's ongoing refusal to follow the rules. The pastor was arrested the next day and quickly posted the $500 bond to get out of jail. At that point, he scaled back on his war against the stay-at-home order and announced that he would keep his church closed for the time being. Howard Brown insisted that he wasn't shuttering the church out of respect for COVID policy, but to protect his congregants from government tyranny. He denied the sheriff's allegation that he had repeatedly ignored warnings to start following the rules and described his arrest as unnecessary. The pastor further claimed that his church was following social distancing guidelines and taking other safety precautions, and he denied that there were any political overtones to his strongly worded sermons. Authorities dropped the charges 2 weeks later. Howard Brown was no stranger to controversy before the pandemic. In 2017, he referred to Hurricane Irma as a nothing burger, despite the storm killing at least 50 people and causing widespread power outages to millions of homes. A few weeks later, he claimed that elite Hollywood celebrities routinely drink blood, practice cannibalism, and ritually sacrifice children. He's also known to dabble in alt-right conspiracy theories and other ideologies that encourage people to be extremely paranoid about the government trying to control their every move and thought. It would likely take all day to mention every inflammatory and eccentric statement that has come out of Howard Brown's mouth, so I'm going to assume that you get the idea and move on to the next item on today's list. Number 11. Julius Shaknow. Julius Shaknow grew up in a Jewish household in Brooklyn, New York during the 1920s and 30s. After serving in World War II, he converted to Christianity and began studying the Bible. During the 1960s, he began preaching near his home in central Connecticut under the name Brother Julius. Shaknow was not a particularly remarkable or attractive man. He was short, had a scraggly beard, and carried an overall frumpy appearance, but he had an uncanny ability to draw people in with his words and charisma, and he quickly began to build a following. In addition to his public speaking talent, Shaknow had good timing. He began spreading his message at a time when young people were increasingly rejecting mainstream religion and seeking spiritual guidance outside traditional church settings. During the late 1960s, Shaknow established a group called The Work. In 1970, he began claiming that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. His followers believed him, and the group continued to grow. They eagerly indulged in their new leader's sermons, which contained an unusual mix of Christianity, Judaism, and science fiction. Members began turning their paychecks over to Shaknow, giving him and his wife Joanne complete control over their finances. They received a small allowance while the rest of their money went straight into Shaknow's pocket, funding a lavish lifestyle while the congregants themselves lived in abject poverty. Shaknow imposed strict rules on his followers that he didn't follow himself. Women were banned from wearing makeup and were required to dress conservatively while their leader led a promiscuous and wanton lifestyle. At some point, he began sleeping with group members' wives, which he referred to as special work. He also used his knowledge of scripture to con young women into bed, convincing them that it was God's will for them to be intimate. Over time, Shaknow became increasingly controlling and abusive. He allegedly began hitting entire families with belts during his sermons, while everyone else watched, and started claiming that he was God. It sounds crazy from the outside looking in, but by then his followers were brainwashed. Most of them continued to believe what they were told, and those who dared to leave were told that terrible things would happen to them. Shaknow continued to rule over his cult with an iron fist, until his death from a heart attack in 1996 at the age of 71. His chief apostle, Paul Sweetman, took over until he was imprisoned for bank fraud in 1999. Sweetman disappeared shortly after his release in 2004. His leg bone was found on a golf course a month later, but it wasn't identified until years later. Former members Rudy Hannon and Sorek Minery were charged with Sweetman's murder in 2018. Hannon died from COVID in 2020 while awaiting trial, and Minery took a plea deal in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. He claimed that he and Hannon killed and dismembered Sweetman at the urging of his wife, Joanne, and distributed the body parts throughout the state. Joanne died in 2011 before any charges were brought in the case. The cult reportedly still exists today and has somewhere between 75 and 100 members. Number 10. Jamal Carelock. During the early morning hours one day in 2017, police were called to an apartment complex in Washington, D.C., where they found Jamal Carelock's unit engulfed in flames. Carelock, who was the pastor of a church in Baltimore, wasn't home when officers arrived. He told law enforcement he was in Georgia at the time, although cell phone data placed him just a mile from the scene within 5 minutes of the alarm being pulled. The fire caused over $40,000 in damages and left at least one neighboring unit uninhabitable. Investigators soon discovered that Carelock applied for a fire insurance policy just 8 days before the blaze broke out. In an $11,000 claim he filed after the fire, he wrote that he wasn't responsible for causing it and said that he lost items that he had actually removed from his apartment before the fire. Based on the evidence at the scene, experts concluded that Carelock had doused his mattress in gasoline and deliberately torched the apartment. In a statement, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia said that numerous residents were evacuated from the 94-unit complex during the fire, including elderly people and young children. Carelock was arrested on a slew of charges and ultimately pleaded guilty to arson, felony destruction of property, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and, as I'm sure you could probably guess, is no longer a pastor. Number 9. Mark Lewis. Just days before Christmas in 2013, Sarah Nottingham went to the church in Vacaville, California, where her boyfriend Mark Lewis served as a pastor, and told him that she no longer wanted to be with him. She was unhappy with his behavior and suspected that he was involved in criminal activity, and she wanted no part of any of it. During the meeting, Lewis allegedly warned her that she had created a monster by breaking up with him. In a filing document for a restraining order against Lewis, Nottingham wrote that she had been trying to end the relationship for weeks. She also claimed that when she refused to see Lewis on Christmas Eve, he threatened to ruin her holiday. The next day, Nottingham found her car windshield shattered. A few weeks later, someone threw a Molotov cocktail through her living room window, causing a fire to break out. Police were quick to pull over a U-Haul truck not far from the scene with 3 homeless locals inside. The suspects, who were identified as 30-year-old Kristen Broyles, 28-year-old Richard Wright, and 33-year-old Anthony Newbolt, reportedly admitted that Lewis had persuaded them to firebomb Nottingham's property. All 4 suspects were charged in connection with the case. During a search of Lewis's home, investigators found methamphetamine, a gun, and other evidence connected to the crime. According to court documents, at least 3 informants told law enforcement that in the 2 years leading up to the firebombing incident, Lewis was distributing methamphetamine and involved with burglaries. Nottingham told reporters that Lewis abused his position as a pastor by gaining vulnerable people's trust and then manipulating them into doing his dirty work. He allegedly provided down-and-out individuals with food, shelter, clothing, and other things before asking them to damage the property of people who upset and commit other crimes. Lewis initially rejected a plea deal that would have sentenced him to 10 years in prison. He ultimately pleaded no contest to stalking and arson and received an 8-year prison sentence. The other 3 suspects received sentences ranging from 16 months to 11 years. This may not be the end of Lewis's legal troubles. During the highly publicized case, law enforcement launched a separate investigation into the suspicious death of his ex-wife, who was found dead in 2011 from what initially appeared to be a suicide. Number 8. Carlton Funderburk. In a disturbing display of entitlement that was captured on camera in 2022, the founder of a megachurch in Missouri berated his congregation for not buying him a luxury watch. In the clip, Carlton Funderburk called his followers poor, broke, busted, and disgusted for not forking bigger donations to the church at the well in Kansas City. During the scathing sermon, he asked, "I'm not worth your McDonald's money? I'm not worth your Red Lobster money?" Funderburk went on to ask worshippers if he was worth the designer labels they spend money on. He complained that he had asked them to buy him a Movado watch from Sam's Club the year before, but never got one. In case you're wondering, Movado watches typically go for anywhere between $300 and $3,000. Funderburk continued talking down to his churchgoers, calling them his cheap sons and daughters. He justified his insulting rant by saying that he was just trying to get everyone to understand what God is saying. Footage of the disturbing diatribe went viral on TikTok, and the online community was quick to voice its disapproval of Funderburk's behavior. Many commentators accused him of being a greedy, false prophet who took advantage of his followers. One social media user asked which of the Gospels mentions a Movado watch, conveying the sheer obnoxiousness of Funderburk's tantrum. The disgraced pastor posted an apology video to the church's YouTube channel. He claimed that there was context behind the content of the clip, but he acknowledged that he had hurt people with his words and insisted that the video did not reflect what was in his heart. Funderburk specifically addressed those who had never heard of him until they saw the viral clip, stating that he regretted giving such a negative first impression of himself. He said that he had apologized to the congregation privately and that they remained loving and supportive toward him. He also apologized to preachers and pastors who were personally affected by the controversy. While Funderburk may have done enough damage control to stop his congregation from turning against him, many people were unmoved by the apology. Number 7. Linda Green. In 1991, a group of traveling New Age practitioners called the Samaritan Foundation bought an abandoned jail in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and began living in it. They were led by a woman named Linda Green and had followed her around the country as she held seminars to promote her beliefs and gain new followers. Green's philosophy was based largely on a practice called dowsing, which involved using a pendulum and a chart to make decisions. She encouraged her followers to dowse when it came to everything from serious illnesses to choosing their outfits for the day. After buying the old jail, Linda strongly encouraged her followers from around the country to move in. Many people were quick to drop everything and abandon their families and careers. The building was dilapidated and falling apart, but the group tried to make it livable by installing showers and converting the jail cells into sleeping areas. They spent most of their days studying under Linda's guidance, which became increasingly dark and controlling over time. She claimed that evil forces were threatening humanity and told her followers that they had to dedicate their lives to her teachings in order to stop the apocalypse from happening. According to Linda, they could save the world through intensive dowsing, which sometimes went on for days with no breaks. Group members eventually started becoming delirious from the lack of sleep and fresh air. Local police became concerned that the group was a cult and tried to investigate, but Linda refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, she became increasingly paranoid that authorities were threatening her control over her followers. She forbade everyone from using the phone or leaving the compound, effectively cutting them off from any contact with the outside world. Linda eventually became so paranoid that she disbanded the group and relocated to Wyoming with 3 members, including her ex-husband Dennis Green and her current husband Alan Ross. Linda had divorced Green for Ross when the group was living in the abandoned jail. Green felt emasculated and hurt, but was so brainwashed that he remained loyal to Linda. Alan Ross had met Linda through her teachings and had only ever known her in the capacity of a spiritual leader. Seeing her outside of a cult setting at the house in Wyoming opened his eyes to the fact that she was a mere mortal. Ross began to realize that Linda was abusive and started reclaiming his freedom. In 1995, he took a job on a film project out of state. Linda was so angry at him for doing something without her permission that she tracked him down and showed up at the job site. In what would turn out to be a fatal mistake, Ross left the job and returned to Wyoming. When friends and family stopped hearing from Ross entirely, they began to worry that he had encountered foul play. They had always thought Linda's lifestyle and beliefs were strange and suspected that Ross had gotten sucked into a cult, but they knew that Ross would never voluntarily cut them out of his life. The family spent 5 years urging law enforcement to search the Wyoming home for Ross's body. Finally, in 2000, his remains were found partially buried in a crawl space in the basement. He had been shot twice and castrated. Linda was no longer living at the house and had relocated to Arkansas. She died in 2001 from alcohol-related liver failure and was never charged in the case. Former Samaritan Julia Williams eventually admitted that she had helped move Ross's body. She claimed that Linda's ex, Dennis Green, had shot Ross, but many believe that she was just trying to prevent Linda from being implicated in the crime, even in death. Williams was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and served 2 years in prison. Dennis Green denied shooting Ross and claimed that Linda had committed the murder. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened or who was responsible for it, but it was clear that Ross had paid for his decision to leave the cult, and Linda with his life. Number 6. Mariam Mabula. Founded in 2008, the London-based Salvation Proclaimers Anointed Church, also known as SPAC Nation, attracted a large following of young worshippers, mostly under the age of 30, and portrayed itself as a charity that helped former gang members and criminals turn their lives around. The church was praised by the press as recently as 2018, but things took a dramatic turn the following year when law enforcement began investigating dozens of allegations of fraud and other possible crimes. Former members accused the congregation's leaders of pressuring them to take out large loans and to give the money to the church. The funds were allegedly used to support the lavish spending habits of high-ranking members, including senior pastor Mariam Mabula, who won the public over with stories about her journey as a reformed criminal. In 2020, she was outed as a career fraudster who's done time in the UK, Belgium, and Italy. By then, she had at least 13 convictions under her belt. In the BBC documentary Catch Her If You Can, multiple women described how Mabula allegedly swindled them out of anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The victims were frustrated at law enforcement's apparent lack of action against Mabula, and they banded together to expose her crimes and warn the public. They claimed that Mabula offered to help them in various ways as a way to gain access to their money. In one case, she reportedly offered to use her connections to buy discounted airfare for a woman who wanted to visit her dying grandmother in Jamaica. The woman wired Mabula the money to make the purchase, but never received the plane tickets. Another victim was evicted from her home after being bilked out of thousands of dollars and going so broke that she searched beneath her furniture for spare change to buy food with. In response to the allegations against some of its leaders, SPAC Nation said that it wasn't responsible for what happened in members' homes or elsewhere outside the church. Amid the controversy, the ministry was deemed insolvent and rebranded itself as various new churches and organizations. According to the most recent updates, both the organization and Mabula were under investigation, but criminal charges have not been brought against any suspects. Number 5. Travis Clark. During a nighttime walk in September 2020, a passerby noticed that the lights were on at the Saints Peter and Paul Catholic Church in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana. Out of curiosity, they peered in through a window and were shocked by what they saw. The church's priest, Travis Clark, was getting freaky on the church's altar with 2 dominatrixes. The women were dressed in corsets and high-heeled boots, not exactly their Sunday best, and and Clark was half naked. They were surrounded by an array of items that didn't belong in any part of a church and appeared to be filming the encounter using a cell phone on a tripod and portable stage lighting. The horrified onlooker captured footage of the encounter and turned it over to law enforcement. Because the unholy hookup occurred within public view, police went to the scene and arrested Clark and the two dominatrixes for obscenity. During questioning, 23-year-old Melissa Chang and 41-year-old adult film actress Mindy Dixon said that they were filming role play with Clark. The day before the incident, Dixon reportedly wrote in a social media post that she and another dominatrix were traveling to the New Orleans area to defile the house of God. Both women pleaded guilty to reduced misdemeanor charges and received 2 years of probation each. Clark was kicked out of the priesthood shortly after his arrest. He pleaded guilty to felony obscenity and received a 3-year suspended prison sentence, along with 3 years of probation. In addition to being fined $1,000, he was ordered to pay $8,000 in restitution to the church, perhaps to replace the altar that was ritually burned and destroyed. Number 4. Kevin Wallin. In a shocking example of how quickly someone's life can spiral out of control due to drugs, Kevin Wallin went from being a highly respected Catholic priest in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to earning himself the nickname Monsignor Meth over a 2-year period starting in 2011. When parishioners began to notice subtle changes in his appearance and behavior that grew more obvious with time, he lost a considerable amount of weight in a short time, began acting strange, and became increasingly absent from his priestly duties. Rumors soon began to swirl about Wallin doing very unpriestly things in his spare time. He cross-dressed, bought an adult novelty store, and engaged in steamy trysts with various men. Within months of the noticeable shift in his behavior, the Archdiocese placed him on leave and then suspended him for failing to address personal and health issues. Wallin's double life was further exposed in early 2013 when the 61-year-old was arrested for dealing crystal meth. Federal prosecutors accused Wallin of leading a methamphetamine distribution ring and laundering his ill-gotten proceeds through the adult shop. If convicted of all the charges he originally faced, he could have faced a lifetime in prison. He pleaded guilty to a methamphetamine conspiracy charge and received a shockingly lenient sentence of just 5 years and 5 months. With credit for time served after his arrest, it amounted to 3 more years behind bars. In hindsight, Wallin's fall from grace was less sudden than it had seemed. Subtle signs of his growing disillusionment with the Catholic faith began to appear years earlier, when the stress of running a church that was on the verge of financial ruin began to wear away at him. By the time Wallin was arrested, fellow clergy members were well aware of his active dating life, despite his vow of celibacy, but they didn't know that he was trafficking drugs and were at least somewhat oblivious to the full scope of his other life. Even after the truth came out, Wallin received dozens of letters of support urging the court for leniency. After his release, he seemed to have a hard time staying on the straight and narrow. In 2018, Wallin was sent back to prison for 9 months for failing a drug test and violating his parole. It's unclear what he's up to or how he's doing now. Number 3. Michael Todd. In 2022, footage of American megachurch pastor Michael Todd covering a parishioner's face with his saliva during a sermon went viral. The gag-inducing clip showed the preacher spitting into his hand while on stage at the Transformation Church in Tulsa and talking about how Jesus restored a blind man's sight with his saliva. Audience members could be heard gasping and groaning in shock and disgust as Todd rubbed his hands together and smeared his spit all over the face of a parishioner who was standing beside the pastor with his eyes closed. In addition to being gross to begin with, the sickening display came amid a spike in COVID-19 infections throughout Oklahoma. Within days, the video had garnered millions of views on social media. The internet rescinded with widespread disapproval of Todd's bizarre behavior, and he was quick to apologize in a Twitter post. He admitted that the act was disgusting and explained that his passion for giving people hope sometimes caused him to go to extremes. Todd was aware that he had taken his excitement too far and that the spit demonstration took away from the message he was trying to convey. The man who received the strange spit bath was identified as Todd's brother, who declined to comment on the incident. Todd reassured his followers that he had checked on his brother to make sure he was doing okay amid all the unexpected publicity. Number 2. Kirtanananda Swami. Steve Bryant grew up moving from place to place as a military brat and struggled to find his place in the world after barely graduating high school. His soul-searching mission came to an end in 1974 when he crossed paths with a recruiter from the Hare Krishnas, a Hinduism-inspired religious group that became famous on the streets of America's cities for their chanting and robes. Bryant was sold on their promises of enlightenment and abandoned his wayward lifestyle to become a full-fledged member of the group. He moved into the Krishna temple, where he shaved his head, traded his blue jeans for a robe, and became a vegetarian. 3 years later, he met and married his wife Jane, and they moved onto a sprawling 500-acre Krishna commune in rural West Virginia called New Vrindaban. Led by a man named Kirtanananda Swami Bhaktapada, or Guru K for short, the community had a questionable reputation among the Krishnas for being extreme in its practices. Steve was appalled by the dismal living conditions at New Vrindaban, where he and Jane slept on a basement floor with no indoor bathroom. While devotees lived in filth and had nothing, Guru K and his highest-ranking disciples stayed in the group's opulent temple and wanted for nothing. When Steve discovered that the leader and his entourage were beating people as a punishment for breaking the rules, he began challenging the leadership at New Vrindaban and ultimately decided to leave. Jane refused to go with him and remained at the compound. Now living out of his van, Steve vowed to expose the truth about Guru K. For 2 years, he traveled to Krishna communes across the country, interviewing members who had also experienced abuse and corruption at New Vrindaban. They implicated Guru K in fundraising scams, forced prostitution, physical abuse, and other horrifying crimes. Steve also found a letter written by the late founder of the Krishna movement, Swami Prabhupada, describing Guru K as a crazy person and a false prophet. In 1986, Steve decided he had done all he could to make law enforcement and Krishna leaders aware of what was going on at New Vrindaban, and that it was time to let go and start a new life. But that never happened, because one of Guru K's top enforcers tracked him down in Los Angeles and shot him at point-blank range when he was sitting in his van. The shooter, Thomas Drescher, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. Federal investigators found damning evidence that Guru K paid Drescher to carry out the hit. His fingerprints were on the money that was paid to Drescher for the murder, and it appeared as though there were also plans in the works for another paid hit on a Krishna member that Guru K was warring with. Kirtanananda Swami and his enforcers were eventually ousted from New Vrindaban, and he served 8 years in federal prison for mail fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and other charges. After his release in 2004, he moved to India, where he died in 2011 at the age of 74. Since then, the Krishna governing body has implemented new measures and increased oversight for preventing corruption and abuse within its ranks. Number 1. Joseph Mcloone.
And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content.
During an audit in 2018, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia discovered that one of its priests, 55-year-old Joseph Mcloone, had opened a bank account in his parish's name 7 years earlier. He never told anyone about it, and the account wasn't on the parish's books, which violated Archdiocese policy. The Financial Council froze the account and launched an investigation, which found over $110,000 in deposits that were never recorded in the church's records. While some of the things that the money was spent on were consistent with typical parish expenses, other findings were concerning. Monsignor Mcloone admitted to using some of the funds for inappropriate personal expenses, including travel and a beach house. He had also sent payments to men he met on the Grindr dating app and had relationships with, which was in clear violation of his vow of celibacy. He resigned from the church and was charged with felony theft and other crimes. Mcloone pleaded guilty to 2 counts of mismanaging money. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, which included 9 months of house arrest. He was also ordered to perform 300 hours of community service, write apologies to the church and archdiocese, and pay more than $30,000 in restitution. Additionally, the disgraced pastor was ordered to provide a DNA sample, undergo a mental evaluation, and get any treatment that the results indicated he needed.
17. David Chiselton. Public defender Aaron Brockler faced an uphill battle for negotiating any kind of leniency for David Chiselton. His client was accused of assaulting his girlfriend and burning down an apartment building in Cuyahoga County, Ohio in 2019. By then, Chiselton had a mile-long rap sheet that included violent past offenses, and he now faced a multitude of charges including felonious assault and multiple counts of aggravated arson. Brockler and the prosecution reached an agreement that would require Chiselton to plead guilty to several charges in exchange for a sentence of 9 to 100 years. If Chiselton took the deal, it would be up to the judge to decide the sentence. It certainly was no guarantee that he would receive the 9-year minimum. In fact, that was highly unlikely, but it was the best Brockler could do for his client. Chiselton took the deal and hoped for a 9-year sentence. When the judge sentenced him to 47 years, he became infuriated. Blaming his defense attorney for the sentence, Chiselton sucker punched Brockler in the face while in handcuffs, knocking him unconscious. Court officers immediately tackled Chiselton and handcuffed him, this time behind his back rather than in front. Meanwhile, Brockler regained consciousness. He had a broken nose and a concussion. Authorities charged Chiselton with felonious assault, but a jury acquitted him of the charge after his attorney successfully argued that Brockler's injuries weren't serious enough to qualify for a conviction under the charge. Chiselton clapped gleefully after the verdict was read and let out a satisfied hoot as he was being led out of the courtroom. Speaking with the ID channel series Chaos in Court, Brockler said that he and Chiselton had a good relationship up until that point, and that he did everything he possibly could to negotiate the best possible outcome for his client. He was disappointed about the acquittal because he felt it sends the message that people can assault their attorney and get away with it. 16. Alan McCarty Jr. During a family court hearing in Volusia County, Florida in 2017, 36-year-old Alan McCarty Jr. was denied custody of his children. During this particular hearing, he was accused of threatening his kids and violating a restraining order. His lengthy criminal history, which spanned at least 3 states and included priors for domestic violence, kidnapping, indecent exposure, and other charges, may have also had something to do with the judge's decision. McCarty became furious with the judge, Stasia Warren. After the hearing, he dialed 911 and said that he wanted to report a crime that was about to happen. He instructed the dispatcher to bring Judge Warren into the parking lot so he could execute her, and he also threatened the dispatcher. After hanging up, McCarty called 3 more dispatchers and continued making threats against Warren. He was charged with threatening a public official and was facing up to 40 years in prison if convicted. For the next year, he languished in jail with no bond while awaiting trial. His trial began in 2018 in front of Judge Matt Foxman. McCarty refused to cooperate with his public defender or wear a suit and tie, so he was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. When the courtroom was ordered to rise at the beginning of the hearing, McCarty remained seated and gave the judge the middle finger, yelling that he wasn't under oath. He then launched into a verbal tirade about how the court was unfair to him for taking his kids away from him, and he threatened Judge Foxman. The judge asked McCarty, "Do you want to be here or not?" He replied that he didn't want to be there and that he was being unconstitutionally prosecuted. McCarty accused the court of violating his rights and basically acted like an armchair legal expert who thought that everyone else was the problem and that his behavior had nothing to do with the situation he was in. Foxman remained calm while court officers surrounded McCarty just in case something was about to happen. The defendant was ultimately removed from the courtroom and put behind a 2-way mirror, where he was out of sight but could still hear and respond to everything that was going on. He continued to yell and cuss, but the case eventually proceeded. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes before finding McCarty guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 15. Keith Swainson. After receiving criminal mischief complaints one Saturday night in 2016, Houston police responded to the home of 49-year-old Keith Swainson. A 7-hour standoff ensued as officers tried making contact with the suspect. At one point, Swainson opened fire on responding officers through the windows of his house. a police sergeant shot back and was struck by debris from Swainson's gun. After failing to get him to cooperate, a SWAT team deployed tear gas into his home, at which point he finally surrendered. During his initial court hearing 2 days later, Swainson began shouting and swearing at the judge. Someone nearby yelled at Swainson not to talk like that, which only seemed to exacerbate his out-of-control behavior. Disturbing footage of the outburst showed the suspect being led out of the courtroom by multiple law enforcement officials, with what appeared to be dried blood all over the side of his face. When questioned about Swainson's injuries, defense attorney David Parrish II told the press that his client had a right to seek medical care, or not. He further explained that the jail had medical staff who were capable of treating Swainson, and speculated that the defendant hadn't got a chance to seek treatment yet, given the eventful nature of the last few days. The outcome of Swainson's case is unclear, but prison records show that nobody by his name is currently in custody in Texas. 14. Kimberly Kessler. When 34-year-old mother of 3 and hairstylist Jolene Cummings disappeared from her workplace in 2018, suspicion fell on her co-worker, Jennifer Seibert. She denied doing anything to harm Cummings, but the evidence quickly stacked up against her. While investigators couldn't find the victim's body, they found evidence of a large amount of blood that had been cleaned up inside the hair salon where the women worked, and surveillance footage showed Kessler throwing out heavy garbage bags outside the building long after her shift ended. She had also gone to Walmart earlier that evening and bought cleaning supplies and an electric knife before returning to the workplace. After finding Jolene's missing SUV and surveillance footage connecting Seibert to where it was left, the police had enough evidence to at least arrest Seibert for stealing the missing woman's car. They picked her up at a rest stop where she was living in her vehicle and questioned her further about Jolene's disappearance while booking her for the vehicle theft charge. In addition to behaving in an overly animated way, Seibert admitted that she'd been living under aliases for 20 years and that her real name was Kimberly Kessler. She was eventually indicted on a first-degree murder charge. Over the next year, the court wrestled with the issue of Kessler's mental state and her competency to stand trial. She'd gone on a hunger strike in jail, losing over 100 pounds, and her behavior had become increasingly erratic over time. Corrections officers described having cups of urine thrown at them, being threatened and harassed by Kessler, and finding feces smeared on the walls of her jail cell. Kessler was ruled incompetent to stand trial and sent to a mental hospital for 6 months in an effort to restore her competency so the case could resume. Another year went by and she was transferred back to jail. Her weight continued to drop and her behavior remained out of control. At one point, the sheriff asked the court for permission to force feed her, but she began eating again. After 2 more mental evaluations, the judge ruled Kessler competent to stand trial. By then, the prosecutors had begun to speculate that she was exaggerating her condition in hopes of being found not guilty by reason of insanity. When she refused to attend her pre-trial hearings, Kessler was strapped to a chair and wheeled in. She screamed and shouted during almost every single court appearance, accusing her former defense attorney of being related to Jolene Cummings. The claim was found to be untrue. On most occasions, Kessler was removed from the courtroom so the hearing could proceed. Her displays may have prolonged the cause, but she was eventually forced to face justice. The jury convicted her of Jolene's murder and sentenced her to life without parole. 13. Jacob Larson. Judge John McBain is known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. So, when accused stalker Jacob Larson showed disrespect in the courtroom one day in 2016, things got ugly fast. The victim told the judge that Larson had violated a protective order that Judge McBain had issued on a previous occasion. She said Larson was continuing to contact her despite the order banning communication between the two. To make matters even more disturbing, the woman reminded the judge that she and Larson didn't even know each other, but that he'd pursued her relentlessly after she made it clear she had no interest in him. When McBain asked Larson why he violated the order, he claimed that the victim instigated it by posting attractive photos on social media. The victim told the judge that she had no connections with him on Facebook, Twitter, or any other platform. Frustrated with Larson's apparent lack of cooperation with the protective order, McBain admonished him for his obsessive behavior, reminding him that all he had to do was leave her alone. Larson accused the judge of being buddy-buddy with the victim, once again failing to take responsibility for his actions. McBain sentenced him to 3 days in jail, but Larson continued to talk back. Each time he mouthed off, McBain increased the sentence until finally it reached 93 days. There was only one court officer in the room, and when he tried to handcuff Larson and take him into custody, Larson resisted. A struggle ensued, at which point Judge McBain removed his robe and rushed over. He could be heard instructing the officer to tase his ass right now as he got on the ground to help the officer get Larson under control. They managed to subdue the defendant without tasing him and hauled him off to jail. Sadly, Larson didn't learn from the experience. After serving his 93-day sentence for contempt, he went right back to stalking his victim. He was convicted of aggravated stalking and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 12. Melissa Hardwick. Kentucky Family Court Judge Jennifer Edwards was listening to a man explain why he filed a domestic violence complaint against his estranged wife in 2011 when things suddenly spiraled out of control. The estranged wife, Melissa Hardwick, interrupted her husband and was warned by Judge Edwards to stop or she would face a contempt charge. She disobeyed the order and Edwards made good on her promise, sentencing the woman to 10 days in jail. Hardwick reacted to the punishment by lunging at the judge. Footage of the incident showed Hardwick charging over the bench as nearby court deputies yanked her away. She could be heard yelling at the deputies to get off her as they ordered her to put her hands behind her back and handcuffed her. Hardwick continued to yell obscenities and threatened Judge Edwards as she was dragged out of the courtroom. In the moments following the attempted assault, Edwards appeared slightly shaken as she rummaged through court paperwork. She rescued herself from the case and mentioned her plans to have Hardwick criminally charged for her behavior. What started out as a 10-day punishment against Hardwick for contempt ultimately became a 120-day jail sentence. In addition to the contempt charge, she was accused of making terroristic threats, intimidating a judge, and resisting arrest. Hardwick was sentenced to 5 years of probation and ordered to undergo a mandatory mental health evaluation and anger management courses. As a Cleveland Municipal Court judge mentioned in the ID Channel series Chaos in Court, Hardwick was lucky that the bailiffs intervened quickly enough to stop her from reaching the judge, or she would have faced much more serious charges. 11. Donna Coso. During the summer of 2016, Amanda Coso drunkenly crashed head-on into an SUV in Redford Township, Michigan, killing a 31-year-old man and critically injuring his fiancée. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of operating under the influence causing death and was sentenced to 3 to 15 years in prison. A man in the courtroom laughed and smiled the entire time while a surviving family member of one of the victims delivered an impact statement. Judge Kiana Lillard admonished him for his behavior, calling him a clown, and had him removed from the courtroom. Right after she kicked him out, she had Amanda's mum, Donna Coso, taken away for allegedly laughing and smirking during the hearing. During her disgusted diatribe, the judge addressed Amanda's family directly, stating, "I understand you're all very upset because your loved one is going to prison. But guess what? She's going to prison for the choices that she made." Donna was initially ordered to spend 93 days in jail, but was released the following day after apologizing to Judge Lillard, adding that she'd been under a lot of stress. 10. Jason Clare. One evening in June 2011, Jason Clare made the fateful decision to go to a bar in St. Cloud, Florida, that was offering an unbeatable happy hour price of 4 beers for $1. While there, he got into an altercation over a girl with brothers Joel and James Gunn. Claire would later describe being pinned to the ground and brutally beaten by 3 people outside the bar. At some point during the incident, he managed to get a hold of his gun and open fire, killing the Cunn brothers. During police questioning, Clare insisted that he acted in self-defense and out of fear for his life. He was severely injured and claimed that it was from the Cunn brothers beating him before he shot them. Witnesses gave a much different story, painting Clare out as the aggressor and making it sound like the shooting was completely unprovoked. They said that bystanders beat Cunn out of anger after he shot the victims. Authorities charged Clare with murder, and he continued to maintain his innocence based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. More than 30 relatives on both sides of the case showed up in court for a pre-trial hearing to determine whether Clare had grounds to argue self-defense. To everyone's disappointment, the judge delayed the position due to new evidence that was presented during the hearing. Tensions were high as these two groups of people with starkly opposing views on the case filed out of the courtroom and into a narrow hallway toward the building's exit. So, it wasn't too surprising that all hell broke loose when a friend of the Cunn brothers, Jeremy Mcloone, bumped into Clare. The defendant's stepfather, James Parker, immediately challenged Mcloone to a fight. Punches were thrown as the situation devolved into pure chaos, and Parker was soon entangled in a fistfight with the Cunn brothers' father, James Cunn Sr. Bystanders shrieked as deputies tried to break the two men up, but they remained fiercely determined to continue beating each other. Parker relentlessly administered one blow after another against his younger and larger opponent, like a vicious guard dog prepared to take down his enemy at all costs. The fight came to a sudden stop when a court officer threatened to tase the men. Both Parker and Cunn were charged with disorderly conduct and banned from attending any further hearings on the case. The charges against the dueling dads were ultimately dismissed, but Clare was convicted of the Cunn brothers' murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 9. Anthony Deese and Jerome Stewart. 59-year-old Dale Williams Sr. of Youngstown, Ohio, was convinced that his girlfriend of 4 years, Elizabeth Pledger Stewart, was cheating on him. She wasn't, but Williams' mind was made up, and there was no convincing him otherwise. He would later tell police that he'd threatened to harm Elizabeth if she didn't stop messing around behind his back. One morning in 2017, Williams decided that she'd gone too far with her alleged infidelity. He ran her car off the road with his van and then shot Elizabeth repeatedly in cold blood. The victim died from her injuries, and Williams was charged with murder. After 2 years of court proceedings, he pleaded guilty to stalking and killing Pledger Stewart. During the first of what would become 2 sentencing hearings, Pledger Stewart's sons, 23-year-old Jerome Stewart and 30-year-old Anthony Deese, charged at Williams. The attack came seemingly out of nowhere, catching the entire courtroom off guard as Deese and Stewart's sister prepared to read a victim impact statement. One of the brothers jumped over a table while the other ran around it. The brothers took Williams to the ground and punched him repeatedly while court officers tried to separate the fight, which ended after one of the men was tased. They were both held in contempt of court and jailed for 30 days on charges of assault and obstructing official business. Williams was taken to the hospital for his injuries and was back in the courtroom a week later for a second sentencing hearing. He was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. Mahoning County Sheriff Jerry Green told NBC News that he understands how emotions can run high in a courtroom, but that fighting is unacceptable. 8. J. Person-Lynn. Prominent California attorney J. Person-Lynn had been practicing law for over a decade and had been involved with some high-profile cases when he got into a troubling dispute with a court bailiff in 2019. He had gone on to the San Bernardino courthouse on his day off to deal with routine business that he thought could be handled by the court clerk, but was directed to the courtroom to address the matter. Because Person-Lynn didn't expect to go before a judge that day, he was wearing everyday clothing rather than the crisp suit and tie that he normally wore in court. A deputy told him to sit in the gallery area of the courtroom, where non-attorneys usually wait to address their cases. Person-Lynn explained that he was an attorney, and the deputy instructed him to speak with the bailiff. Instead of listening to what Person-Lynn was trying to say, the bailiff told him to stay out of the part of the courtroom that was reserved exclusively for attorneys. Once again, he explained that he was an attorney and that he was there to discuss a case. He reached into his back pocket to grab his wallet and show the staff members his bar ID, but before he could do that, an officer pushed him out of the attorney-only area. Courtroom footage appears to show the officer putting his hand on Person-Lynn's chest. The attorney would later tell the ID series Chaos in Court that it was the first time anyone had ever shoved or grabbed him in a courtroom. He continued trying to explain to the deputies why he was in court, but was told to leave. Court officers were seen escorting Person-Lynn out of the courtroom and out of the camera's view. In an audio recording of the conversation, Person-Lynn could be heard giving a deputy the number of the case he was trying to deal with. By then, he was understandably frustrated, and he minced no words while telling the staff that they screwed up and that he planned to legally come after them for the way they treated him. Just moments later, one of the deputies tased him. Person-Lynn was charged with obstructing an officer in the performance of his duty. He was sentenced to a year of probation. The deputy who tackled him was not charged for excessive force, but some believe that he should have been. A judge accused Person-Lynn of escalating the situation, but he was left feeling suspicious that he was treated differently because of his race. 7. Taylor's Schabusiness. In early 2022, a mother came home to find her son, 25-year-old Shad Therian, dismembered and scattered throughout the basement of their Green Bay, Wisconsin home. Police identified the last person Shad was with as 24-year-old Taylor Schabusiness and tracked her down. They found more of Shad's body parts in her van. Schabusiness reportedly admitted to using methamphetamine with the victim before the murder. She claimed that she snapped and blacked out and couldn't remember what happened during the violent episode. Authorities charged her with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and assault. Given the horrific nature of the crime and the young woman's behavior, her mental health has landed at the center of her court proceedings. During a competency hearing in early 2023, Schabusiness's court-appointed attorney, Quinn Jolly, asked the judge to reschedule the session so the defense could have extra time to review the case. Something about Jolly's request apparently sent Schabusiness into a rage. She charged at her lawyer and elbowed him in the head. A nearby court deputy wrestled her to the ground, and she was removed from the courtroom. Despite her erratic behavior, the judge found Schabusiness competent to stand trial and granted Jolly's request to withdraw from the case. 6. Wesley Thomas. 19-year-old Michael Roark was a U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia when he joined an anti-government militia of disgruntled soldiers who called themselves Forever Enduring and Always Ready, or FEAR. Formed in 2011, the extremist group had some extremely heinous crimes on its agenda, including assassinating then-President Barack Obama, blowing up major dams, launching deadly chemical attacks, infiltrating the drug trade, and doing other things to take down the federal government. At some point, Roark began dating a young woman named Tiffany York, and his involvement in FEAR lessened as he focused on his new relationship. He also made plans to leave the military, causing the group to worry that he would rat them out to authorities. To prevent that from happening, 4 FEAR members lured Michael and Tiffany into the woods by inviting them on a hunting trip. After getting the couple into a remote area, the renegade soldiers ambushed them with gunfire, fatally shooting them both. Christopher Salmon, Anthony Peden, Isaac Agwigwi, and Michael Burnett were charged with murder. During a pre-trial hearing for Anthony Peden, who was accused of firing the shots that killed Tiffany, the young woman's stepfather Wesley Thomas lost control of his emotions and lunged at the defendant. It took 4 court officers to take him to the ground and handcuff him. In the meantime, Roark's father shouted out in Thomas's defense, reminding the court that he was a father who just lost a child. When the officers lifted Thomas to his feet, one of them patted him on the chest as if to let him know that he understood why Thomas was upset, but he had to do his job and maintain order in the court. Peden, Christopher Salmon, and Isaac Agwigwi were all sentenced to life in prison for murder, while Burnett received an 8-year sentence for reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation against the other 3. Courtroom chaos broke out again during Christopher Salmon's sentencing hearing, when he tried to say he was sorry for his actions. Unwilling to entertain the apology, a member of Roark's family yelled at him to shut up, but he obeyed the judge's command for order in the court, and that was the end of his outburst. 5. Robert Fleck. During a DUI hearing in Jefferson County, Kentucky in 2014, Assistant District Attorney Robert Fleck got into an argument with the defendant's lawyer. Just months earlier, he had been suspended for 30 days for threatening a public defender. Upon returning to work, he'd signed a zero-tolerance agreement promising to keep his behavior under control. Clearly, that didn't last. The DUI hearing spun out of control as Fleck belittled the defense attorney, calling him "buddy boy" and shouting over him as he tried to argue his case to the court. Fleck repeatedly ignored the judge's orders to maintain his composure as he devolved into a diatribe about how disrespected and insulted he felt by his rookie opponent. Frustrated with the unprofessional behavior, the judge called a recess and ordered for the hearing to resume later that day. That was unacceptable to Fleck, who had lunch plans with his mother. As the courtroom cleared out, he stood at the microphone and droned incredulously about how the recess was causing him to stand up his 83-year-old mother. The judge refused to entertain the argument and reiterated the court would resume that afternoon at 1:00 p.m. Fleck said that, "For the record, I think this is BS," and stormed out of the courtroom. After having a little while to cool down, he apologized to the court for his outburst, explaining that he couldn't bear the thought of his mother showing up for lunch and him not being there as promised. But he continued to blame the defense attorney for his behavior, so the judge cut him off and told him to either apologize or don't apologize. He apologized and was probably lucky that the judge didn't hold him in contempt. After hearing about the incident, Fleck's bosses decided that enough was enough and fired him. He now practices on the other side of the aisle as a criminal defense attorney. 4. Donald Byrd. While working as a strip club security guard in Miami in 2012, Lukachi Kendall approached two unarmed African-American men who were sitting in a vehicle and opened fire on them, killing Kijwan Byrd and leaving Michael Smathers paralyzed from the waist down. Kendall argued in court that he shot the victims in self-defense based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. But even in a state that gives gun owners unusually wide parameters for pulling the trigger in the name of self-defense, Kendall's claims seemed outrageous. Not only did the evidence show that the victims desperately tried to take cover while Kendall relentlessly sprayed them with bullets, he had a criminal record and a troubling history of mentally unstable behavior. He'd been kicked out of the Navy and certainly had no business working as an armed security guard. Throughout his court proceedings, Kendall was examined by multiple mental health experts who concluded that he was competent to stand trial. When his pre-trial hearing finally rolled around in 2014, 2 years after the murder, several of the victims' relatives were there, including Kijwan Byrd's father, Donald. During the hearing, Kendall's defense attorney argued that his client should be kept under observation at a local mental hospital. Outraged by the mere suggestion, Donald Byrd began yelling about how Kendall belonged in prison. He accused the defendant of playing crazy and rose from his seat while family members and a court officer tried to calm him down. The anguish in Donald's voice was heart-wrenching, and his heightened emotion was understandable, considering the fact that he lost a son to senseless violence and that Kendall reacted to his outburst by smirking. But a courtroom demands order, and the grieving father had to be removed when he didn't stop yelling. Thankfully, Donald ultimately got his wish. Kendall was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3. Jeremy Shue. After suffering from a number of strokes, 39-year-old Jeremy Shue was left with limited use of his legs and arms. In early 2020, he was rolled into an Ann Arbor, Michigan courtroom in a wheelchair to face a slew of felony charges for a series of home and vehicle break-ins, as well as a drug possession charge. During the hearing, Shue's attorney filed a motion to recuse the judge, David Schwartz, because he felt as though the judge had treated his client unfairly in the past. This type of request is typically granted in cases where a defense attorney can successfully argue that a judge has a bias against the defendant. But Shu's attorney failed to convince the court that his client would get a fairer shake under another judge, and the motion was denied. In response, the defense attorney asked to be withdrawn from the case, most likely so Shu couldn't accuse him of ineffective counsel, and for another lawyer to be assigned to help his client. Swartz denied the attorney's request, at which point Shu asked to represent himself. In response, the judge told Shu that he thinks representing himself was a foolish idea. Shu said, "That's your opinion," and the judge responded, "That's fine, you don't have to buy my opinion." By then, it was obvious based on Shu's escalating tone that he was becoming increasingly frustrated. He continued to challenge Swartz, who remained impressively calm and gave Shu permission to represent himself. The judge set a trial date, and Shu instantly became angry because he didn't think it gave him enough time to prepare his case. Swartz basically told him that he had no say in the matter and reiterated the planned trial date. Despite being in a severely weakened physical state due to his health problems, Shu was so overcome with rage that he managed to muster enough strength to flip over the defense table. Court officers pushed him back down into his wheelchair and removed him from the courtroom. To add to his growing list of legal problems, Shu was held in contempt of court on a $50,000 bond. 2. Peter Hafer. 30-year-old Peter Hafer was accused of stealing $51,000 worth of jewelry from a big box store in Scott County, Kentucky in 2008. In a scene that sounds like it came straight out of an action movie, he allegedly broke into the store through its HVAC system in the middle of the night and slid down a rope onto the sales floor. He was charged with third-degree burglary and criminal mischief and faced up to 5 years in prison if convicted. During a court hearing, Hafer asked the judge to replace his court-appointed attorney, Doug Crickmer. He accused Crickmer of failing to provide adequate representation, while Crickmer told the judge that Hafer expected things that the court wasn't willing to provide, including a lesser sentence than what had been offered to him as part of a plea deal. The attorney later told the ID channel series Chaos in Court that it tried to negotiate in Hafer's favor, but the prosecution was unwilling to budge, and Hafer blamed him for it. Much to Hafer's dismay, the judge denied his request. It's clear based on courtroom footage that the defendant was about to boil over with anger. After brewing for a few moments, as if to contemplate his next move, Hafer punched Crickmer in the face full force and knocked him to the ground. He continued to beat the attorney, while most of the court staff stood around dumbfounded. There was only one officer in the courtroom at the time, so the judge hit the panic button. By the time deputies flooded into the room and apprehended Hafer, Crickmer was seriously injured. He told Chaos in Court that he had no memory of what happened between the moment he noticed Hafer's fist heading toward his face and when he woke up in the hospital. Crickmer opted not to press charges against Hafer, but he was done acting as his attorney. In the end, the situation worked out for Hafer, who finally got his wish and received a new lawyer. But the judge was less forgiving than Crickmer over the assault and sentenced the defendant to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. 1. Marco Perea. Just days before Christmas in 2014, police officer Charles Condek was shot dead while responding to a noise complaint at an apartment building in Tarpon Springs, Florida. The killer, Marco Perea, had been released from prison just 9 months earlier for other crimes and was on parole at the time of the shooting. The complaint that Condek was responding to had nothing to do with Perea, and the officer was sadly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the suspect fled the scene in a stolen car, he ran over the dying cop. Perea had a lengthy criminal history, so people understandably found it hard to believe he was being sincere when he expressed remorse for his actions. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and the case went to a jury to decide whether he would receive the death penalty or spend the rest of his life in prison. At the beginning of his sentencing hearing, Perea apologized to Condek's family and begged the jury to spare his life. After deliberating for 5 hours, the jury came back with their decision and handed their paperwork to the judge, who looked it over and announced that Perea would be sentenced to death. Relieved sighs could be heard throughout the courtroom, but when the judge checked the sheet showing the jurors' individual verdicts, he noticed that 2 of them had voted against the death penalty. In Florida, a jury must be unanimously in support for the death penalty in order for it to be imposed. The jury foreman had checked the wrong box on the paperwork. After catching the mistake, the judge announced that Perea would spend life in prison, generating happy reactions from his family and utter dismay from pretty much everyone else in the courtroom. Condek's loved ones sobbed loudly as they broke down from what felt like the cruelest blow of injustice yet. Unfortunately, nothing could be done to change the outcome of the case, leaving them with no other choice than to find ways to cope with the decision and carry on with their lives.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather be forced to join a cult that lives in the middle of nowhere or be in a wheelchair for the rest of your life? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.